Pharmaceutical magnate George Merck submits a report to the newly appointed Secretary of War Patterson. Included is a letter from former Secretary of War Henry Stimson. The committee recommends pursuing a biological warfare program with great secrecy. Established in 1943, Camp Detrick became the life force of American biological weapons research. The facility was handpicked by the newly appointed War Research Director, George Merck, the president of Merck & Company, the pharmaceutical giant.
You are in Fort Detrick, the Army Biological Laboratories, to protect this country against a biological attack, that is, a silent assault by an invisible cloud that carries disease organisms.
During World War II, it would become the leading producer of anthrax.
Some disease organisms being studied are so tiny that a single drop of liquid culture may contain millions of them. During incubation and growth of the embryo, the virus multiplies to more than 12 million times the original number.
A metal sphere was erected, 4 stories high, where aerosol pathogens were tested on animals and people. They called it the 8-ball.
It is sometimes necessary to try out a disease aerosol on volunteers. The chamber has been used to expose humans to Q fever. The spray bearing the Q fever organism was piped into the facepiece.
Interest had also been stirring in the realm of incapacitating agents, ones that are not fatal but would cause chronic illness, germs that would halt workforce production or military movement, or weaponized pathogens that could wipe out an entire food source.
Denied the products of our farms and factories, we could not wage war on any front.
Livestock became a central target in the world of biowarfare, but the perfect testing facility for animal diseases had yet to be built. In Merck's report, plans are made to begin a program that will be run by the military through non-military branches of the government to ensure the public not being unduly exercised.
So it's interesting that we have Plum Island was set up by Eric Traub shortly after the war in the 1950s, who was a Nazi biowarfare expert with expertise in insect warfare.
Plum Island Animal Disease Center, the offshore germ warfare research lab of Fort Detrick, located right off the tip of Long Island and only miles away from the Connecticut shore. Researchers there would have unlimited access to deadly zoological diseases, ones that transfer from animals to humans, some so dangerous that they were banned from labs located inland. The $10 million complex came complete with guardhouse gate entry, sewage decontamination site, emergency power plant, storage, landfills, corrals and laboratory fencing, Labs 101 and 257, an incinerator, and the infamous tick colony, said to be another contribution by Traub. Plum Island experimented with ticks. We had a tick colony, where you would take them and feed them on the virus and breed ticks to see how many generations it would last. Dr. Jerry Callis, former Plum Island director. In 1954, the U.S. Army officially handed over the Plum Island Animal Disease Center to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the aforementioned non-military branch of the government. This wholehearted cooperation among Army, Navy, and civilian scientists was truly outstanding. At the forefront of this effort was the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, the same agency that hired Eric Traub. A multi-branch operation would keep the project secret from American enemies and the American public. The following seemingly random events are actually calculated components in a deliberately complex machine. Please pay attention.
You don't know a thing about syphilis, except that you've got it.
From 1932 to 1971, the U.S. Public Health Service, together with the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, carried out the longest-running example of human experimentation in U.S. history. The official title of the study, The Effects of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male.
Those little wriggling things, they're the syphilis germs, the spirochetes.
399 men were used as guinea pigs in the name of scientific advancement. They were told they were being treated for bad blood. In reality, they were being monitored for the effects of late-stage syphilis. Their compensation? A hot meal, a ride, and a burial stipend. They were uneducated sharecroppers who found stature in the program. The African-American doctors and nurses found it to be a vehicle that would propel them through the racial inequities of their profession, state, and era. This manipulation of health and hope continued for 40 years with the full support of the Center for Disease Control.
Medical science has developed a specific cure for syphilis.
For them, there was no cure, only inexplicable suffering, and then death. The devastation spread far beyond the infected men, their wives and children. It spawned generations of citizens who could no longer trust the governmental bodies that are in place to protect them. Constitutional boundaries were violated, and American citizens were involved in their government's clandestine experimentation.
The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong.
Thousands of sheep are found dead outside an Army testing facility. The Army had conducted several experiments days prior. The open-air burning of over 160 gallons of nerve agent, the firing of a chemical artillery shell, and the third, which is thought to be the cause of the deaths, an aircraft spraying nerve agents roughly 27 miles west of Skull Valley. At the time, the Army had conducted at least 1,100 tests of chemical and biological weapons without public knowledge. There was no formal explanation of these events until 30 years later. Sworn testimony at a Department of Defense appropriations hearing sets the tone of the bioweapons research program, revealing a cavalier and completely unremorseful attitude. Dr. MacArthur, within a period of 5 to 10 years, it would be possible to produce a synthetic biological agent, an agent that does not naturally exist and for which no immunity could have been acquired. Senator Sykes, are we doing work in that field? We are not. Why not? Lack of money or lack of interest? Certainly not lack of interest.
If you take an element that by itself might not be lethal, and you mix it with other elements that by themselves might not be lethal, you can create a lethal cocktail. And you might be potentially could create a cocktail which there's no known countermeasure or cure, and that there's no way to easily detect it.
President Nixon announces an end to offensive use of biological weapons. Yet, the size and budget had grown significantly over the last 8 years.
There are actually laws passed by the Nixon administration. The United States is no longer involved in offensive biological warfare research, only defensive research. The problem is that when it comes to biological warfare, it's hard to separate offensive from defensive. In other words, the sorts of things that you do for defensive work are perfectly applicable to offensive research. So it's blurred. There's a blurred line there between offense and defense.
We have now narrowed down the Vice President's problems on this thing to one issue, and that is whether we should include these health maintenance organizations like Edgar Kaiser's Permanente thing. The Vice President just cannot see it. We tried 15 ways from Friday to explain it to him and help him to understand it. He finally says, well, I don't think they'll work, but if the President thinks it's a good idea, I'll support him 100%. Well, everybody else's judgment very strongly is that we go with it. And he's the one holdout that we have in the whole office. I don't mind my doubts about it, but I think that it's... now let me ask you, you give me your... You know I'm not too keen on any stand that this, let me tell you how I am on one theory about this. This is a private enterprise one. Well, that's beautiful. Edgar Kaiser is running a Permanente deal for profit. And the reason he can do it, I had Edgar Kaiser come in and talk to me about this, and I went into it in some depth. All of the incentives are toward less medical care, because the less care they give them, the more money they make. The incentives are on the right way.
It was that day that George Merck's pharmaceutical industrial complex had reached the office of the President of the United States. The Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, would now battle a profit-loss analysis in nearly every medical case to come, a reality that Lori experienced firsthand.
Insurance was meant to be indemnification, meaning to put you back into the place you were, no better, no worse, just before your loss. And that is the cornerstone of insurance that has been long since abrogated. Insurance company CEOs make obscene bonuses in the millions of dollars, and it's all to patient detriment. Insurers hold the profits, the purse strings to the profitability of any doctor's practice these days. They can shut a doctor down with amazing efficiency.
In a hearing before Congress on the United States Bioweapons Program, testimony reveals at least 44 tests in 19 years in public domain, civilian areas without public knowledge. They include Washington, D.C., 4 tests with Parkinson's in 2 years, an infectious bacterial agent, later tests conducted at a national airport and a Greyhound bus terminal. New York City, light bulbs filled with pathogens dropped in the path of subway cars. Pennsylvania, tests conducted on Tuscarora and Kittakinny tunnels, as well as State Highway 16, exactly 1 mile from benchmark 193. Undisclosed testing at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Hampton Roads, Virginia, 2 Navy vessels conduct 1 trial at anchor, 16 at sea. The question is, over water or over land? Panama City and Key West, Florida, aerial dispersal of infectious agents. 2 separate tests in Alaska, 5 in Hawaii, 2 in Oahu, Hawaii's most populated island. 271 universities and private companies held 734 contracts with Fort Detrick, aiding in the research, development, and implementation of tests, including Dow Chemical, Merck & Company, the Michigan Department of Health, and Yale University. What was the impact? The civilians had no idea the danger they were in. Dugway Proving Grounds, the site of the Skull Valley incident, an undisclosed number of tests were conducted over 4 years. California, San Diego, Camp Cook, San Clemente, Santa Barbara, on and offshore artillery testing. San Francisco, Navy artillery dispersal over the city results in at least 1 death.
Title 15?
Yeah.
That is essentially a government statute that allows experimentation on the American public with very little approval necessary. It's been modified slightly over the years, but it still essentially stands. And it still allows the government to do open-air testing, for example, on Americans without their consent, approval, or knowledge even, all under the guise of national security.
His name was Dr. Alan C. Steer. I was surprised that I was not seeing Dr. Gifford, the rheumatologist. He opened the conversation by saying he was going to take down the history of what was going on in Lyme. Other doctors came into the room. Dr. Steer summarized our conversation for them, and there was great interest in what was transpiring. "Isn't this exciting?" one doctor said. "There's certainly something unusual happening here." They were spirited, like archaeologists who had unearthed an intriguing artifact, some bit of pottery that promises even greater riches with just a turn of the spade.
It's hard to really think back to the beginning. I have 4 children, and we've lived in Lyme for quite a long time. And at one point, we started getting swollen joints, and it was really kind of scary because we never had anything like that. Suddenly one of the children, couldn't walk and was dragging his leg, and very strange rashes that would appear, and one of them, I remember, spread all across one of my children's back, and just a lot of physical things were happening that no one could explain, and it was very frightening. We'd go to the doctors and they'd shake their head when we came in again with another swollen knee or a swollen ankle or whatever. They thought I was, I think, a hypochondriac. Eventually I gathered the names of a great number of people in our area that were also having this problem. I mean, you drive along the road and there were kids on crutches waiting for the school bus. And so I started, with permission from people, interviewing people that were having trouble, and kept pursuing it. And eventually I went into the Yale University and reported the first cases of Lyme disease.
What most people don't realize is that there were problems on the tip of Long Island long before the outbreaks at Old Lyme. There were outbreaks in that region and along the coast, the Sound, as well, that very much looked like they were Lyme disease, actually. So we think that, that some of it had gotten out already. That became the focus of everyone's attention. Old Lyme, Connecticut was a new epicenter of the illness.
Looking back, there were a lot of hints that something was the matter. I know on Cape Cod we'd get tick bites and all, but it took years to really, see the pattern in it.
And you had Connecticut, the tip of Connecticut where Old Lyme is. You had Long Island here, Long Island South. That area, such a heavy concentration. What was there? What was there was Plum Island.
On Plum Island, they were working on using insect vectors as a source of a delivery system for biological warfare agents. They were working on different agents. At the time, the U.S. Army had a presence on Plum Island. So it wasn't just a USDA facility, it was a government facility which had classified work going on. Accidents occur. They were doing at one point in time open-air experiments with insect vectors on Plum Island. Well, that's absurd. You can't contain anything just because it's on an island. Whoever was doing it wasn't smart enough to figure out that birds fly to the island and fly away from the island on a daily basis. Deer swim across the water that they thought was the impenetrable barrier. The facilities at one point deteriorated to the point where they no longer had viable containment.
Towards Plum Island, I was sunbathing on a beach when I got really sick. And I don't know whether the ticks, they say the ticks can ride the deer into the shore. I remember seeing ticks in the sand, which was strange. Gathered a whole list of cases and made an appointment to go into Yale University. Yeah, I went in and reported to Alan Steer at Yale and Dr. Malawista, and I kept in close contact with them for a long time.
Alan Steer is a member of EIS, and so are several of the other luminaries associated with the Lyme disease epidemic. The Epidemic Intelligence Service, this is an agency that was set up, it was modeled after the Japanese biowarfare defense system, where they had a group of doctors that were on call in case anyone ever used biological weapons against Japan. They would call these doctors in to diagnose the patients and try to determine whether it could be due to a biowarfare attack or whether it was just a natural epidemic. So after the war, the U.S. set up a similar system.
After reading the letter from Dr. Steer and Dr. Malawista, I couldn't help but think that they were playing down the severity of the illness. The concluding paragraph of the letter, which stated that they believed Lyme arthritis to be a relatively mild type of arthritis which may be self-limited, did not match my experience or my family's experience at all. It seemed that there was room to acknowledge that the ailment could be rather serious.
Alan Steer calls renowned tick specialist Willy Bergdorfer, a Swiss medical scientist at the National Institute of Health's Rocky Mountain Labs. He wanted to learn firsthand the complicated method of dissecting ticks to search for the viral agent he believed caused Lyme disease.
In the early days when Steer was conducting his investigation, you had all these doctors around him were treating people with antibiotics, and they were all getting better. And they would tell him about it, and he would just dismiss them. He knew better.
Steer's patients received only symptomatic treatments like aspirin and steroids, and continued to be monitored through blood and spinal fluid tests.
Were these things done to find out who was susceptible and who wasn't?
In 1983, Alan Steer bestows the honor of naming the spirochete a disease he had devoted his professional career to, Borrelia burgdorferi, after the man he elicited help from 6 years previous.
Once I found the organism and once the cause of the disease is known, it didn't take very long that it was spread all over the United States and the world. I was very happy that I found that organism, the Borrelia burgdorferi. It will carry my name as long as I live.
Dr. Stier seemed to be less receptive to what patients were describing, and I felt it more difficult to understand his position on diagnosis, treatment, reinfection, and seronegative patients.
If you look at Stier's history, first he claimed Lyme was caused by a virus. He was wrong. He claimed it was spread by a species of ixidid tick that didn't exist. He was wrong. And now he's looking, and has been looking for decades, for some kind of mysterious autoimmune mechanism, which he's never found, which he claims causes the chronic form of the disease. He's wrong about that. All these excuses are just rationales for him not to treat people so that he can monitor the disease as it grows in people, just like they did with the syphilis spirochete in the Tuskegee experiment.
So right now, I guess you have two camps in the United States. One group think that you have chronic Lyme disease and it deserves chronic treatment, and another group that says, well, yeah, you may have chronic Lyme disease, but a month of treatment is plenty.
My constituent, Dr. Joseph Bruscano of East Hampton.
Dr. Bruscano. Thank you very much for holding this committee meeting, and again, thank you for the very nice introduction. You've heard today that there are many problems in the field of Lyme disease, and I wanted to address one of the core problems that you may not be aware of. Some have called this the Lyme disease conspiracy. There is in this country a core group of university-based Lyme disease researchers and physicians whose opinions carry a great deal of weight. Unfortunately, many of them act unscientifically and unethically. They exert strong, ethically questionable influence on medical journals, which enables them to publish and to promote articles that are badly flawed. They work with government agencies to bias consensus meetings and have worked to exclude from these meetings and scientific seminars those with alternate opinions. They behave this way for reasons of personal or professional gain and are involved in obvious conflicts of interest. Some of them are known to have received large consulting fees from insurance companies to advise the companies to curtail coverage of any additional therapy beyond their empiric 30-day course. This group promotes the idea that Lyme is a simple, rare illness that is easy to avoid, difficult to acquire, simple to diagnose, and easily treated and cured with 30 days or less of antibiotics. The truth, however, is that Lyme is the fastest growing illness in this country after AIDS, infectious illness after AIDS, with a cost to society measured in the billions of dollars. It can be acquired by anyone who goes outdoors, very often goes undiagnosed for months, years, or even forever in some patients, and can render the patient chronically ill and even totally disabled, despite what this core group of physicians refers to as, quotes, adequate therapy. Long-term studies on patients who were undertreated or untreated demonstrated the occurrence of severe illness more than a decade later, reminiscent of the findings of the notorious Tuskegee study. Following the lead of this group of physicians, a few state health departments have now begun to investigate in a very threatening way physicians who have more liberal views on Lyme disease diagnosis and treatment than they do. And indeed, I have to confess that today I feel that I am taking a personal risk, a large one, because I'm stating these views publicly for fear that I may suffer some repercussions, despite the fact that many hundreds of physicians and many thousands of patients all over the world agree with what I'm saying here today.
Bruscano's courageous testimony sparked fierce retribution from the Stier camp and the Infectious Disease Society of America. The first blow would come immediately. A CDC meeting was planned to officially accept Stier's Lyme disease testing criteria as standard practice, a testing criteria that not only has the potential but the probability of leaving thousands of Lyme sufferers undiagnosed.
Is the conference that was organized by the CDC that was held in Dearborn, Michigan. And a group of people who had looked at antibodies and antigens in some detail were convened to take a look to see how do we come up with a consensus opinion on what to use for tests for Lyme. Well, they thought that simply looking at one strain of Borrelia gave them the lowest incidence of false positive IgM. Now, that strain is the one we use to this day. and it's the strain from Germany. So if you say, my sister's IgM antibodies are negative, then I'm going to say, okay, she's negative for the Borrelia found in Germany.
That wasn't the only conflict. The decision to exclude 2 Lyme-specific outer surface proteins from the testing seemed outright negligent.
Well, OspA was excluded in the sense that they felt that OspA was expressed after the organism was in people. And that was the argument given to exclude it. But it makes no sense to me. That's what we want.
Later, it was learned that Dearborn was just a distraction. Steer's criteria had already been accepted by the CDC months earlier at an FDA vaccine advisory meeting.
If you start looking for arguments that are based on follow the money, you might want to look to see whether or not there was any influence from those associated with vaccine development with the Dearborn criteria. Because OspA was left out, and OspA was the marker that was going to be used to show efficacy of the vaccine. Whenever we have a consensus panel, we need to say, who are they, who's paid them, what is their hidden agenda?
They've created this simple-minded model of the disease in the public eye so that they can justify perpetuating the epidemic because they're all paid by insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies.
Not only did the NIH, CDC, Department of Defense, and GlaxoSmithKline have financial interest in the Lyme vaccine LymeRix, but Yale owned a patent on OSPA. Steer was paid to conduct clinical trials, and 11 of 12 IDSA members stood to profit from related grants and patents. The reason for excluding OSPA from the test? Any person who received the vaccine would test false positive for Lyme disease, and this would never pass FDA regulation, effectively eliminating billions in profits. In 2002, LymeRix was pulled from the market, citing slow sales, even though reported cases of Lyme disease were increasing. The real reason? LymeRix was causing debilitating symptoms. And what about Steer, whose clinical trials warranted the vaccine safe?
He was publicly thanked by the company in the literature for suppressing the adverse reactions to the experimental vaccine, got the vaccine to the market, which just happened to induce the very symptoms that the vaccine was supposed to be preventing. So if you're looking for a one-man wrecking crew, Alan Steer is it.
I just didn't approve of what was going on with the vaccine. But I'd seen pictures of rabbits and things, and you know, just because I was in an area where there was a lot of research going on, and I was privy to some of the early studies and things, and so I didn't suggest using the vaccine.
The United States president got Lyme disease. A senior U.S. senator got Lyme disease, Schumer of New York. So you've got these guys in the IDSA that have set up this panel that are claiming Lyme disease is hard to catch, easy to cure, when in fact they know that it isn't. They've created an environment where a U.S. president potentially cannot get treated for a disease which is known to cause major neurocognitive impairment. That's a grave national security risk that they've created, which is treasonous. I mean, it's pure and simple.
The Infectious Disease Society of America's clinical guidelines for diagnosis and treatment of Lyme disease are published. They are accepted by the Center for Disease Control as standard clinical practice and have systematically continued to exclude thousands of Lyme sufferers from being diagnosed and treated, leaving a world of walking wounded. These same guidelines would, 7 years later, allow Lori's doctor to look her in the eye and say, "There's no possible way you can have Lyme disease."
John Q's doctor in a state that is told there is no Lyme disease in his state may only go by the CDC and the NIH guidelines. He's not going to diagnose his patient. Many of the patients in this state and many others are being told they have fibromyalgia, they have chronic fatigue, they have MS, they have ALS. I have all those diagnoses, okay? And basically most of them fit.
Most physicians don't want to even deal with Lyme disease because they know it's politically incorrect right off the bat. And if you're working for an institution, for example, let's say a hospital or university or even a nonprofit organization, and the government gets its hooks on them one way or another, they can put the pressure on. It's something that tends to squelch dissent. So if you're a physician in a hospital and the hospital board has essentially capitulated, you don't dare go against the board. And the Lyme physicians, like the ILADS physicians, many of those have had to go against their own medical boards.
The only thing that was not typical about this is that I won. So many of my colleagues, fine physicians, lost their licenses. And we still have evidence that the Federation of State Medical Boards was in collusion. Court of Appeals said, among other things, that before the engines of the state are started up against an individual, there must be some threshold showing of justification for such an intrusion. And I didn't say it before, but that was a terrible intrusion into my life for a lot of years lost. And that's why I fought it, and I'm proud I won it.
A lot of the universities had military contracts because they paid very well.
There are over 180 universities in the U.S. that have been involved in, either were involved or currently involved in biological defense, and it may be even more than that now. So that's a significant number of universities, and most of them public institutions that are involved. Does the public know about this? Probably not.
Yale and Plum Island have been working together for years. Is it just happenstance that Yale, as a major biowarfare contractor, wouldn't be working? I mean, is there a chance that they wouldn't be working with Plum Island when we know on Borrelia agents, when we know that they were on other type of viral agents?
You know, there's money to be made in medicine, and there's money to be made on disease. Chronic illnesses are eminently marketable. Chronic illnesses guarantee that the pharmaceutical companies can make products from now on, forever or whatever, to treat chronic illnesses that there is no real solution for. They love that. What they hate are rather straightforward solutions to the problem, which will eliminate the problem. They don't want the problem eliminated. That eliminates their income. So don't ever expect pharmaceutical companies to be humanitarian organizations. They're profit centers.
You don't make money selling antibiotics that are now generic. You make money treating symptoms that will go on forever. Why eliminate a disease when you can systematically profit from it for decades? I mean, the major problem is the pharmaceuticals companies run everything. Congress owns stock in the pharmaceuticals companies. They're not going to do anything about it. You've got the FDA and the CDC are run by the pharmaceuticals companies. It's a revolving door. Personnel just rotate between corporate jobs and government agencies. The government agencies that are supposed to be protecting the public when actually they're being used to exploit the public. You create experts by giving them grants, and you control what research they do through the type of grant that you give them.
A lot of these people that are looking at fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue, and a lot of these researchers are able to get funds to study those conditions. If you throw the bacteria mess into it, they're probably not going to be able to get that research. So they like to keep the groups divided.
It became a bigger and bigger political battle to keep those grants.
So you create a mythology about a disease and create experts to perpetuate the mythology. You create this modern day Tuskegee experiment with another spirochete. It's just a much more sophisticated version of the syphilis spirochete. Instead of preventing people from seeing doctors, they're preventing doctors from treating people.
But we're talking about a very opportunistic organism. And as I study the nature of the organisms that we're up against, the stealth pathogens, they're not made to be cured. And there's more genetic genomes on Borrelia, at least 4 times more than there is on syphilis.
The disease has the properties of a biological warfare agent that can destroy you and disable you. They were looking for agents that would do that. It mimics natural infection, so they can potentially spread it through insect vectors and claim that they didn't, the government didn't do it. It's a natural epidemic. The spirochete itself forms what's called cysts, so it's a self-protecting mechanism. It's like it goes into the cyst form, so the antibiotics can't penetrate and kill the actual bacteria. So in that respect, it's the perfect biological warfare weapon. And so it's antibiotic resistant. You can treat it for a while, it looks like it goes away, and then it comes back later on and can potentially disable an entire country, and it will look like a natural epidemic.
Those that have no money, those that have lost their job, those that have no insurance, they have no home left. What do? They die.
From the beginning, if you go back to the 1950s, you find out, lo and behold, it was the pharmaceuticals companies that were basically running the American biological warfare program, such as Merck. So you've got a huge conflict of interest. You've got these private corporations that are working with government agencies to create disease agents for biowarfare. Well, what if these accidentally slip out and start infecting the public and happen to cause symptoms that create billions of dollars worth of profits in pharmaceuticals products? It's a conflict of interest. They can create designer diseases to sell cures that they may already have. And since they run the government agencies that are supposed to be protecting the public, how does the public find out about it? And if you declare it a national security issue and a biowarfare issue, then it's classified.
It is a problem for those of us that have information, but it's incomplete information. And we can't get the complete information because a lot of the information is being withheld from us on purpose. The only thing we can do is to gather the facts as we know them and publish them or put them together and do concrete hypotheses, present those hypotheses, present the support for them, and get other people interested in doing more work. Again, we're fighting a huge apparatus, and I have to really remind you that the thinking about this whole thing goes back to the Cold War. So we're fighting Cold War mentality, essentially. We're fighting the Dick Cheney mentality.
Lyme disease is named after, it's called Borrelia burgdorferi, which was named after a researcher named Willy Burgdorfer, who happened to work at what is now a biological warfare lab it's called Rocky Mountain Labs. And he had been working with Borrelia agents since the 1950s. It's not the same type. It's not the Borrelia agent which causes Lyme disease, but he was infecting various ticks, various exotic ticks with various types of Borrelia agents, which are related to the Lyme disease spirochete, but they're not the same thing. He was developing methods for mass infecting ticks at a government biowarfare lab so that they could be tested and injected with various pathogens in a uniform way so that they could develop model infections of what were called relapsing fever Borrelias.
It was unexpected or suspected find that has revolutionized research with spirochetes, and it's important. We still have syphilis as a very important spirochete acid agent, and what is known now with Burgdorferi and with other spirochetes may open the door for research on spirochetes like Treponema pallidum and others.
So we have this disease that breaks out. It has properties that the government was looking for some kind of biological disabling agent. It breaks out right outside of a government biowarfare facility. It is isolated by a biowarfare researcher. It is first cultured by another biowarfare researcher who now heads a biowarfare lab. The epidemic is being perpetuated by people associated with a government biowarfare defense lab. And by the way, the government has just recently come out and admitted that Lyme disease is a biowarfare agent and is being studied in labs all across the country. So whether the spirochete, which causes Lyme disease, is a biowarfare agent is not a question. The only question is, at what point did the government get involved?
You have a disease, a group of infections spreading faster than wildfire, and a government that wants to cover it up.
Well, I mean, that's always the problem with dealing with biological entities is that they're ever changing. They're not going to be static. They won't stay the same. They will change. They will evolve. They will mutate. And you can't stop that process. And once they're out, once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back. And I think Lyme disease is a perfect example of that. Once it's out, you can't put it back. And you can't ignore it. You can't deny it. You can't pretend it's not there and it'll go away. It won't go away. It'll continue to penetrate into the population, continue to cause disease and suffering until somebody at a high level finally decides that we're going to do something about it, and we're going to acknowledge that the problem exists, and we're going to seek ways to finally stop it. The only thing that we can do as scientists and physicians and humanitarians is to try and seek the truth and take that truth and make it widely known.
And who's responsible? And to me, I feel various governments playing around with chemicals and agents that were made into extremely dangerous pathogens are responsible. And to me, I hope in my lifetime that they can pay for it.
Hello.